Aphorisms 50 Part 2, 51, and 52 of Book 2 of the New Organon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jeffrey Edwards. The New Organon by Francis Bacon. Translated by James Spedding, Robert Leslie Ellis, and Douglas Denon Heath. Aphorisms 50 Part 2, 51, and 52 of Book 2. The third of the 7 modes above mentioned relates to that which, whether in nature or in art, is the great instrument of operation, viz., heat and cold. And herein man's power is clearly lame on one side. For we have the heat of fire, which is infinitely more potent and intense than the heat of the sun as it reaches us, or the warmth of animals. But we have no cold, save such as is to be got in winter time, or in caverns, or by application of snow and ice, which is about as much perhaps in comparison as the heat of the sun at noon in the torrid zone, increased by the reflections of mountains and walls. For such heat as well as such cold can be endured by animals for a short time, but they are nothing to be compared to the heat of a burning furnace, or with any cold corresponding to it in intensity. Thus all things with us tend to rarefaction, and desiccation, and consumption, nothing hardly to condensation and inteneration, except by mixtures and methods that may be called spurious. Instances of cold therefore should be collected with all diligence, and such it seems may be found by exposing bodies on steeples in sharp frosts, by laying them in subterranean caverns, by surrounding them with snow and ice in deep pits dug for the purpose, by letting them down into wells, by burying them in quicksilver and metals, by plunging them into waters which petrify wood, by burying them in the earth, as the Chinese are said to do in the making of porcelain, where masses made for the purpose are left, we are told, underground for 40 or 50 years, and transmitted to airs, as a kind of artificial minerals, and by similar processes. And so too all natural condensations caused by cold should be investigated, in order that, their causes being known, they may be imitated by art. Such we see in the sweating of marble and stones, in the dews condensed on the inside of window panes toward morning after a night's frost, in the formation and gathering of vapours into water under the earth, from which springs often bubble up. Everything of this kind should be collected. Besides things which are cold to the touch, there are found others having the power of cold, which also condense, but which seem to act on the bodies of animals only, and hardly on others. Of this sort we have many instances in medicines and plasters, some of which condense the flesh and tangible parts, as astringent and inspissatory medicaments, while others condense the spirits, as is most observable in soporifics. There are 2 ways in which spirits are condensed by medicaments soporific, or provocative of sleep. One by quieting their motion, the other by putting them to flight. Thus violets, dried rose leaves, lettuce, and like benedict or benignant medicaments, by their kindly and gentle cooling fumes invite the spirits to unite and quiet their eager and restless motion. Rose water, too, applied to the nose in a fainting fit, causes the resolved and too relaxed spirits to recover themselves and, as it were, cherishes them. But opiates and kindred medicaments put the spirits utterly to flight by their malignant and hostile nature. And therefore if they be applied to an external part, the spirits immediately flee away from that part, and do not readily flow into it again. If taken internally, their fumes, ascending to the head, disperse in all directions the spirits contained in the ventricles of the brain, and these spirits thus withdrawing themselves, and unable to escape into any other part, are by consequence brought together and condensed, and sometimes are utterly choked and extinguished. Though on the other hand these same opiates taken in moderation do by a secondary accident, namely, the condensation which succeeds the coming together, comfort the spirits and render them more robust, and check their useless and inflammatory motions, whereby they contribute no little to the cure of diseases and prolongation of life. Nor should we omit the means of preparing bodies to receive cold. Among others I may mention that water slightly warm is more easily frozen than quite cold. Besides, since nature supplies cold as sparingly, we must do as the apothecaries do, who, when they cannot get a simple, take its succedaneum or quid pro quo, as they call it, such as aloes for balsam, cassia for cinnamon. In like manner we should look round carefully to see if there be anything that will do instead of cold, that is to say, any means by which condensations can be effected in bodies otherwise than by cold, the proper office of which is to effect them. Such condensations, as far as yet appears, would seem to be limited to four. The first of these is caused by simple compression, which can do but little for permanent density, since bodies recoil, but which perhaps may be of use as an auxiliary. The second is caused by the contraction of the coarser parts in a body after the escape of the finer, such as takes place in indurations by fire, in the repeated quenchings of metals, and like processes. The third is caused by the coming together of those homogeneous parts in a body which are the most solid, and which previously had been dispersed and mixed with the less solid, as in the restoration of sublimated mercury, which occupies a far greater space in powder than as simple mercury, and similarly in all purging of metals from their dross. The fourth is brought about through sympathy, by applying substances which from some occult power condense. These sympathies or consents at present manifest themselves but rarely, which is no wonder, since before we succeed in discovering forms and configurations, we cannot hope for much from an inquiry into sympathies. With regard to the bodies of animals, indeed, there is no doubt that there are many medicines, whether taken internally or externally, which condense as it were by consent, as I have stated a little above. But in the case of inanimate substances such operation is rare. There has indeed been spread abroad, as well in books as in common rumour, the story of a tree in one of the Terceira or Canary Isles, I do not well remember which is constantly dripping, so as to some extent to supply the inhabitants with water. And Paracelsus says that the herb called Rose Solis is at noon and under a burning sun filled with dew, while all the other herbs round it are dry. But both of these stories I look upon as fabulous. If they were true, such instances would be of most signal use and most worthy of examination. Nor do I conceive that those honey dews, like manna, which are found on the leaves of the oak in the month of May, are formed and condensed by any peculiar property in the leaf of the oak, but while they fall equally on all leaves, they are retained on those of the oak as being well united and not spongy, as most of the others are. As regards heat, man indeed has abundant store and command thereof, but observation and investigation are wanting in some particulars, and those the most necessary. Let the alchemists say what they will, for the effects of intense heat are sought for and brought into view, but those of a gentler heat, which fall in most with the ways of nature, are not explored, and therefore are unknown. And therefore we see that by the heats generally used the spirits of bodies are greatly exalted, as in strong waters and other chemical oils, that the tangible parts are hardened and, the volatile being discharged, sometimes fixed, that the homogeneous parts are separated, while the heterogeneous are in a coarse way incorporated and mixed up together. Above all, that the juncture of composite bodies and their more subtle configurations are broken up and confounded, whereas the operations of a gentler heat ought to have been tried and explored, whereby more subtle mixtures and regular configurations might be generated and adduced, after the model of nature and in imitation of the works of the sun, as I have shadowed forth in the aphorism on instances of alliance. For the operations of nature are performed by far smaller portions at a time, and by arrangements far more exquisite and varied than the operations of fire, as we use it now. And it is then that we shall see a real increase in the power of man, when by artificial heats and other agencies the works of nature can be represented in form, perfected in virtue, varied in quantity, and, I may add, accelerated in time. For the rust of iron is slow in forming, but the turning into crocus martis is immediate, and it is the same with verdigris and ceruse. Crystal is produced by a long process, while glass is blown at once. Stones take a long time to grow, while bricks are quickly baked. Meanwhile, to come to our present business, heats of every kind, with their effects, should be diligently collected from all quarters and investigated. The heat of heavenly bodies, by their rays direct, reflected, refracted, and united in burning glasses and mirrors; the heat of lightning, of flame, of coal fire, of fire from different materials, of fire close and open, straitened and in full flow, modified in fine by the different structures of furnaces, of fire excited by blowing, of fire quiescent and not excited, of fire removed to a greater or less distance, of fire passing through various media, moist heats, as of a vessel floating in hot water, of dung, of external and internal animal warmth, of confined hay, dry heats, as of ashes, lime, warm sand, in short, heats of all kinds with their degrees. But above all, we must try to investigate and discover the effects and operations of heat when applied and withdrawn gradually, orderly, and periodically, at due distances and for due times, for such orderly inequality is in truth the daughter of the heavens and mother of generation. Nor is anything great to be expected from a heat either vehement or precipitate, or that comes by fits and starts. In vegetables this is most manifest, and also in the wombs of animals there is a great inequality of heat, from the motion, sleep, food, and passions of the female in gestation. Lastly, in the wombs of the earth itself, those I mean in which metals and fossils are formed, the same inequality has place and force, which makes the unskilfulness of some alchemists of the reformed school all the more remarkable, who have conceived that by the equable warmth of lamps and the like, burning uniformly, they can attain their end. And so much for the operations and effects of heat. To examine them thoroughly would be premature, till the forms of things and the configurations of bodies have been further investigated and brought to light, for it will then be time to seek, apply, and adapt our instruments when we are clear as to the pattern. The fourth mode of operating is by continuance, which is as it were the steward and almoner of nature. Continuance I call it when a body is left to itself for a considerable time, being meanwhile defended from all external force. For then only do the internal motions exhibit and perfect themselves when the extraneous and adventitious are stopped. Now the works of time are far subtler than those of fire. For wine cannot be so clarified by fire as it is by time, nor are the ashes produced by fire so fine as the dust into which substances are resolved and wasted by ages. So too the sudden incorporations and mixtures precipitated by fire are far inferior to those which are brought about by time, and the dissimilar and varied configurations which bodies by continuance put on, such as putrefactions, are destroyed by fire or any violent heat. Meanwhile it would not be out of place to observe that the motions of bodies when quite shut up have in them something of violence, for such imprisonment impedes the spontaneous motions of the body. And therefore continuance in an open vessel is best for separations, in a vessel quite closed for commixtures, in a vessel partly closed, but with the air entering, for putrefactions. But, indeed, instances showing the effects and operations of continuance should be carefully collected from all quarters. The regulation of motion, which is the fifth mode of operating, is of no little service. I call it regulation of motion when one body meeting another impedes, repels, admits, or directs its spontaneous motion. It consists for the most part in the shape and position of vessels. Thus the upright cone in alembics helps the condensation of vapours. The inverted cone in receivers helps the draining off of the dregs of sugar. Sometimes a winding form is required, and one that narrows and widens in turn, and the like. For all percolation depends on this, that the meeting body opens the way to one portion of the body met and shuts it to another. Nor is the business of percolation or other regulation of motion always performed from without. It may also be done by a body within a body, as when stones are dropped into water to collect the earthly parts, or when syrups are clarified with the whites of eggs that the coarser parts may adhere thereto, after which they may be removed. It is also to this regulation of motion that Telesius has rashly and ignorantly enough attributed the shapes of animals, which he says are owing to the channels and folds in the womb. But he should have been able to show the like formation in the shells of eggs, in which there are no wrinkles or inequalities. It is true, however, that the regulation of motion gives the shapes in moulding and casting. Operations by consents or aversions, which is the sixth mode, often lie deeply hid. For what are called occult and specific properties, or sympathies and antipathies, are in great part corruptions of philosophy. Nor can we have much hope of discovering the consents of things before the discovery of forms and simple configurations. For consent is nothing else than the adaptation of forms and configurations to each other. The broader and more general consents of things are not, however, quite so obscure. I will therefore begin with them. Their first and chief diversity is this, that some bodies differ widely as to density and rarity, but agree in configurations, while others agree as to density and rarity, but differ in configurations. For it has not been ill observed by the chemists in their triad of first principles that sulphur and mercury run through the whole universe. For what they add about salt is absurd, and introduced merely to take in bodies earthy, dry, and fixed. But certainly, in these two one of the most general consents in nature does seem to be observable. For there is consent between sulphur, oil, and greasy exhalation, flame, and perhaps the body of a star. So is there between mercury, water, and watery vapours, air, and perhaps the pure and intersidereal ether. Yet these two quaternions or great tribes of things, each within its own limits, differ immensely in quantity of matter and density, but agree very well in configuration, as appears in numerous cases. On the other hand, metals agree well together in quantity and density, especially as compared with vegetables, etc., but differ very widely in configuration, while in like manner vegetables and animals vary almost infinitely in their configurations, but in quantity of matter or density their variation is confined to narrow limits. The next most general consent is that between primary bodies and their supports, that is, their menstrua and foods. We must therefore inquire under what climates, in what earth, and at what depth the several metals are generated, and so of gems, whether produced on rocks or in mines. Also in what soil the several trees and shrubs and herbs thrive best and take, so to speak, most delight. Moreover, what manurings, whether by dung of any sort, or by chalk, sea sand, ashes, etc., do the most good, and which of them are most suitable and effective according to the varieties of soil. Again, the grafting and inoculating of trees and plants, and the principle of it, that is to say, what plants prosper best on what stocks, depends much on sympathy. Under this head it would be an agreeable experiment, which I have heard has been lately tried, of engrafting forest trees, a practice hitherto confined to fruit trees, whereby the leaves and fruit are greatly enlarged and the trees made more shady. In like manner, the different foods of animals should be noted under general heads, and with their negatives. For carnivorous animals cannot live on herbs, whence the order of Fulians, though the will in man has more power over the body than in other animals, has after trial, they say, well nigh disappeared, the thing not being endurable by human nature. Also the different materials of putrefaction, whence animalculae are generated, should be observed. The consents of primary bodies with their subordinates, for such those may be considered which I have noted, are sufficiently obvious. To these may be added the consents of the senses with their objects, for these consents, since they are most manifest and have been well observed and keenly sifted, may possibly shed great light on other consents also which are latent. But the inner consents and aversions, or friendships and enmities of bodies, for I am almost weary of the words sympathy and antipathy on account of the superstitions and vanities associated with them, are either falsely ascribed, or mixed with fables, or from want of observation, very rarely met with. For if it be said that there is enmity between the vine and colewort, because when planted near each other they do not thrive, the reason is obvious, that both of these plants are succulent, and exhaust the ground, and thus one robs the other. If it be said there is consent and friendship between corn and the corn cockle, or the wild poppy, because these herbs hardly come up except in ploughed fields, it should rather be said that there is enmity between them, because the poppy and corn cockle are emitted and generated from a juice of the earth which the corn has left and rejected, so that sowing the ground with corn prepares it for their growth. And of such false ascriptions there is a great number. As for fables, they should be utterly exterminated. There remains indeed a scanty store of consents which have been approved by sure experiment, such as those of the magnet in iron, of gold and quicksilver, and the like. And in chemical experiments on metals there are found also some other worthy of observation. But they are found in greatest abundance, if one may speak of abundance in such a scarcity, in certain medicines, which by their occult, as they are called, and specific properties, have relation either to limbs, or humours, or diseases, or sometimes to individual natures. Nor should we omit the consents between the motions and changes of the moon and the affections of bodies below, such as may be gathered and admitted, after strict and honest scrutiny, from experiments in agriculture, navigation, medicine, and other sciences. But the rarer all the instances of more secret consents are, the greater the diligence with which they should be sought after, by means of faithful and honest traditions and narrations, provided this be done without any levity or credulity, but with an anxious and, so to speak, a doubting faith. There remains a consent of bodies, inartificial perhaps in mode of operation, but in use a polycrest, which should in no wise be omitted, but examined into with careful attention. I mean the proneness or reluctance of bodies to draw together or unite by composition or simple apposition. For some bodies are mixed together and incorporated easily, but others with difficulty and reluctance. Thus powders mix best with water, ashes and lime with oils, and so on. Nor should we merely collect instances of the propensity or aversion of bodies for mixture, but also of the collocation of their parts, of their distribution and digestion when they are mixed, and finally of their predominancy after the mixture is completed. There remains the seventh and last of the 7 modes of operation, namely, the means of operating by the alternation of the former 6, but it would not be seasonable to bring forward examples of this till our search has been carried somewhat more deeply into the others singly. Now a series or chain of such alternations, adapted to particular effects, is a thing at once most difficult to discover and most effective to work with. But men are utterly impatient both of the inquiry and the practice, though it is the very thread of the labyrinth as regards works of any magnitude. Let this suffice to exemplify the polycrest instances. Section 51. Among prerogative instances I will put in the 27th and last place instances of magic, by which I mean those wherein the material or efficient cause is so scanty or small as compared with the work and effect produced, so that even where they are common they seem like miracles, some at first sight, others even after attentive consideration. These, indeed, nature of herself supplies sparingly, but what she may do, when her folds have been shaken out, and after the discovery of forms and processes and configurations, time will show. But these magical effects, according to my present conjecture, are brought about in 3 ways, either by self-multiplication, as in fire, and in poisons called specific, and also in motions which are increased in power by passing from wheel to wheel, or by excitation or invitation in another body, as in the magnet, which excites numberless needles without losing any of its virtue, or in yeast and the like, or by anticipation of motion, as in the case already mentioned of gunpowder and cannons and mines, of which ways the 2 former require a knowledge of consents, the third a knowledge of the measurement of motions. Whether there be any mode of changing bodies per minima, as they call it, and of transposing the subtler configurations of matter, a thing required in every sort of transformation of bodies, so that art may be enabled to do in a short time that which nature accomplishes by many windings, is a point on which I have at present no sure indications, and as in matters solid and true I aspire to the ultimate and supreme, so do I for ever hate all things vain and tumid, and do my best to discard them. Section 52. So much then for the dignities or prerogatives of instances. It must be remembered, however, that in this Organon of mine I am handling logic, not philosophy. But since my logic aims to teach and instruct the understanding, not that it may with the slender tendrils of the mind snatch at and lay hold of abstract notions, as the common logic does, but that it may in very truth dissect nature, and discover the virtues and actions of bodies with their laws as determined in matter. So that this science flows not merely from the nature of the mind, but also from the nature of things. No wonder that it is everywhere sprinkled and illustrated with speculations and experiments in nature, as examples of the art I teach. It appears then from what has been said that there are 27 prerogative instances, namely, solitary instances, migratory instances, striking instances, clandestine instances, constitutive instances, conformable instances, singular instances, deviating instances, bordering instances, instances of power, instances of companionship and of enmity, subjunctive instances, instances of alliance, instances of the finger post, instances of divorce, instances of the door, summoning instances, instances of the road, instances supplementary, dissecting instances, instances of the rod, instances of the course, doses of nature, instances of strife, intimating instances, polycrest instances, magical instances. Now the use of these instances, wherein they excel common instances, is found either in the informative part or in the operative, or in both. As regards the informative, they assist either the senses or the understanding. The senses, as the 5 instances of the lamp; the understanding, either by hastening the exclusion of the form, as solitary instances, or by narrowing and indicating more nearly the affirmative of the form, as instances migratory; striking, of companionship and subjunctive, or by exalting the understanding, and leading it to genera and common natures, either immediately, as instances clandestine, singular, and of alliance, or in the next degree, as constitutive, or in the lowest, as conformable, or by setting the understanding right when led astray by habit, as deviating instances, or by leading it to the great form or fabric of the universe, as bordering instances, or by guarding it against false forms and causes, as instances of the finger post and of divorce. In the operative part, they either point out, or measure, or facilitate practice. They point it out by showing with what we should begin, that we may not go again over old ground, as instances of power; or to what we should aspire, if means be given, as intimating instances. The 4 mathematical instances measure practice; polycrest and magical instances facilitate it. Again, out of these 27 instances, there are some of which we must make a collection at once, as I said above, without waiting for the particular investigation of natures. Of this sort are instances conformable, singular, deviating, bordering, of power, of the dose, intimating, polycrest, and magical. For these either help and set right the understanding and senses, or furnish practice with her tools in a general way. The rest need not be inquired into, till we come to make tables of presentation for the work of the interpreter concerning some particular nature. For the instances marked and endowed with these prerogatives are as a soul amid the common instances of presentation, and, as I said at first, a few of them do instead of many. And therefore in the formation of the tables they must be investigated with all zeal and set down therein. It was necessary to handle them beforehand, because I shall have to speak of them in what follows; but now I must proceed to the supports and rectifications of induction, and then to concretes, and latent processes, and latent configurations, and the rest, as set forth in order in the 21st Aphorism, that at length, like an honest and faithful guardian, I may hand over to men their fortunes, now their understanding is emancipated and come as it were of age, whence there cannot but follow an improvement in man's estate and an enlargement of his power over nature. For man by the fall fell at the same time from his state of innocency and from his dominion over creation. Both of these losses however can even in this life be in some part repaired, the former by religion and faith, the latter by arts and sciences. For creation was not by the curse made altogether and forever a rebel, but in virtue of that charter, in the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread. It is now by various labours, not certainly by disputations or idle magical ceremonies, but by various labours, at length and in some measure subdued to the supplying of man with bread, that is, to the uses of human life. End of Aphorisms 50 Part 2, 51 and 52 of Book 2. End of the New Organon by Francis Bacon, translated by James Spedding, Robert Leslie Ellis, and Douglas Denon Heath. Recording by Jeffrey Edwards.